This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Can I welcome you all to the seminar today? My name is Roger Kane, I'm the Dean of the School of Advanced Study, and these are the Dean's seminars. It's a series of seminars which provides a vehicle for members of staff of the school, visiting fellows to the school, postgraduates in the school to talk over lunchtime in an informal atmosphere and to offer often new research ideas, which I think is what we're going to have this afternoon from Katia. Katia Pizzi, for those of you who are not quite sure of who she is and what she does, is a senior lecturer in one of the school's institutes, the Institute of Germanic and Romance Studies. She's been a senior lecturer and in the school since 2004. Before that, she was at the University of Kent. Her degrees come from Bologna and from Kent and from Cambridge. And she's a prolific writer of books, 5 or 6 of them, the latest of them published just last year on Pinocchio, Puppets and Modernity. This is a new topic, I think, of yours, Katia, or new-ish. You're also writing on futurism and that movement that the Italians were so important in, with Mr. Marinetti and others who I encountered in other incarnations and in writing on planning history and architectural history. But today we're going to have a talk, as you see the title on the screen, about Trieste, which again is a location which has been researched by Katia. Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, Cold War Trieste on screen. Fingers crossed that technology doesn't let you down. Katia, over to you. Please deliver your talk, and then we'll have some questions afterwards. We'll try and wrap things up just a little bit before 2 o'clock if we can, so that people can get off to other things if they've got classes or other commitments at starting at 2. So.
Thank you very much, Roger. So what you're going to see and hear today is material that I'm collecting around a collaborative project that is just beginning between the IGRS Centre for Cultural Memory Studies and a research group based at the University of Tampere in Finland. The research group is called Cities and Transnational Interaction Group, and it's funded by the Academy of Finland. So I really appreciate your assistance in identifying and teasing out critical and interpretive routes through this material, which will be in preparation for a jointly led panel at the European Association of Urban History Conference in August this year. So, Winston Churchill's renowned Iron Curtain speech positioned the Italian city Trieste at the southernmost edge of a watertight barrier between East and West. In many respects, Trieste can still be regarded today as a relic of the Cold War, fossil of an era characterized by conflict, sturdy retrenchments, and fierce oppositions. But how did Trieste find itself at this strategic geopolitical juncture? And what were its implications in terms of Cold War politics, identity, and culture? Historically, in the words of Maura Hamets, I quote, Trieste perches precariously at the edge of Italy and Western Europe, end of quote. Situated at the crossroad of at least 4 countries today, Italy, Austria, Slovenia, and Croatia, bottleneck of 3 major cultural, linguistic, and religious legacies of Europe, the Catholic Latin to the south, the Protestant Germanic to the north, and of course the Orthodox Christian, but also Muslim Slav to the east. Trieste was created artificially in the 18th century in order to provide the Habsburg monarchy with a commercial harbour. In the course of the following 2 centuries, Trieste increasingly came to be associated with a pivotal borderline, a cultural and ideological, as well as a geopolitical terminus, a finis terrae. This borderline is also a dynamic and shifting fault line. Beginning from the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this borderline was redrafted numerous times, in line with the frequent reconfigurations in the geopolitical map of Southern Europe. Long drawn and traumatic, typically pending aggressive operations and sustained military settlements, these shifts scrambled not merely national but also ethnic, linguistic and cultural borders. As a result, the national and cultural identity of these lands is arguably mixed, plural, even schizophrenic and neurotic. It's been described in literature as a neurotic identity. Trieste and its hinterland are characterized by a quintessential border identity, fragmented yet polarized, conflictual yet heterogeneous and hybrid, centrifugal yet self-referential and inward-looking. A precarious identity painfully evidenced in the traumatic tears, the scars etched on the city's historical, political and cultural fabric. If Trieste's border identity is to be regarded as a marker of Trieste's identity across history, this becomes particularly true in the bilateral, border-fixing and volatile framework itself of the early Cold War era. Given its eccentric, multicultural and multilingual setup, further enhanced by the vagaries of the adjacent border, Trieste almost inevitably played a substantial role in feature films in the early Cold War. Indeed, the city became a favorite film set during this period, also thanks to the latest technologies of image reproduction brought in by the Anglo-American allies, particularly cameras and video cameras. And of course, as we shall see later, the Anglo-American allies moved in 1945 and stayed through up until 1954. So there was plenty of opportunity to take film and engage with the film medium. But before I go any further, I will provide you now with some historical coordinates, and I will try and do it as swiftly as possible, so you will have to forgive my sort of long strides and leaps that I take across history. Okay, so here are Italy's northeastern borders. As I already mentioned, Trieste acquired metropolitan status in the 18th century, after the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI granted it maritime and commercial investiture. The city enjoyed a privileged position within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a largely continental federation deprived of harbours and coastal outlets of its own. In the turn of a century or so, Trieste flourished into a major commercial and financial hub, serving the multicultural empire. Immigrants flocked to the city, including investors with capital, exiles and refugees fleeing persecution, adventurers in search of opportunity and fortune, and even James Joyce, of course, albeit later in the 1910s and 20s, can be counted amongst these opportunists sort of coming to Trieste in search of fortune and in search of opportunities. The city grew rapidly into a melting pot, home to a diverse, increasingly affluent and culture-hungry middle class. After 1918 and the defeat and dismemberment of Austria-Hungary, however, Trieste experienced a rapid decline. The city was allocated to Italy, that is to say, to a relatively recently unified country itself, and most importantly, a country that was not short of substantial and long-established ports of its own. In this radically changed context, Trieste found itself redundant and indeed subsidiary to the adjacent Venetian port. So Venice obviously took the lead. Increasingly peripheral, Trieste started suffering social, economic and ethnic backlashes, further complicated by the ruling class's traditional loyalty to Italy. Increasingly nationalistic, this Italian emphasis soon chimed in with a national rhetoric born out of the First World War, and shortly to become appropriated by the fascist movement. Between the 1920s and the 1930s, the fascist regime aimed to erase Trieste's residual cosmopolitan makeup through nationalization of major commercial enterprises and aggressive persecution of Slovenian and Croatian minorities. The idea was to beef up the Italian profile, the Italian makeup of the region. After Nazi occupation, the demise of the Reich, and the end of the Second World War, Trieste was taken over by troops of the Yugoslav Fourth Army, who held the city for 1.5 months. In June 1945, Anglo-American Allied forces reclaimed the city and settled there for the following decade. So it is precisely at this crucial juncture that Trieste encounters the Iron Curtain. The city is now carrying the can for Western civilization at its easternmost edges, a beacon shining through treacherous eastern fogs. Anglo-American troops and Yugoslav partisans, of course, had fought the Nazis and the fascists side by side in this region at the end of the Second World War. However, an insurmountable barrier now kept them resolutely apart. Disagreement over the political future of Trieste became bitterly intense, leading to a quintessentially Cold War solution, that is, the creation in 1947 of an independent state under separate jurisdiction, and the state was called the Territorio Libero di Trieste, or TLT, Free Territory of Trieste. And here you see a breakdown of the Territorio Libero di Trieste. Though it never became an independent state, as had been originally planned, the TLT came into being nonetheless. This was a relatively small portion of land stretching from the Adriatic coast north of Trieste through to the southeastern ports of Cittadinova, as you see down there. Ethnically, this portion of land included a mix of Italians, Croatians, and Slovenians. From 1947 through to its demise in 1954, so the Free Territory has about a decade lifespan, the northern part, or Zona A, was governed by an Allied military government, while the southern portion, or Zona B, was under Yugoslav administration. Trieste, as you can see, was at the heart of Zona A, whereas Koper, or Capodistria, was the administrative capital of Zona B. Incidentally, and this may be a detail that we can sort of dwell on later on, in 1947, a wall, or rather a fence, because it was quite a short wall, was erected in the middle of the city of Gorizia, dividing the Italian side of the city from its Yugoslav counterpart that was named Nova Gorica. You don't see Gorizia here because it wasn't part of the TLT. It was just a bit sort of north of Trieste, 30 miles north of Trieste. But it's an interesting case of a wall being erected that echoes the Berlin Wall, but in a sort of very different framework. Both Italy and Yugoslavia, however, claimed sovereignty over the entire Free Territory. The Allies were well disposed towards Italy, but reluctant nonetheless to forego their military presence in this region. And so at this very juncture, we are at the southernmost edge of the Iron Curtain. In fact, if you see this little segment here, this is the southernmost edge of the Iron Curtain at this stage. The western side relented somewhat as a result, of course, of Stalin and Tito's parting of ways in 1948, the so-called Cominform split, which ushered in Yugoslavia's excommunication and eventually its non-aligned status within the Eastern Bloc. A London Memorandum of Understanding, ratified in 1954, eventually established a permanent boundary, tracking almost exactly the TLT's zone of influence, assigning Zona A, or Zone A, to Italy and Zone B to Yugoslavia. Now, this resolution was deeply unsatisfactory for both Italy and Yugoslavia, who failed to acknowledge it at the time, and they failed to acknowledge it officially until it was permanently ratified with the Osimo Treaty of 1975. So to go back to this funny image of Churchill lifting the Iron Curtain. So Trieste's inherent border identity was revamped and reinforced precisely at this juncture, at the period of time when the city was sitting literally at the foot of the Iron Curtain. As such, Trieste almost inevitably acquired symbolic status as both playground and mirror of the fractious and fragile balance of powers that came to characterize the Cold War era. And as Sir Winston Churchill famously cautioned in his Iron Curtain speech of 1946, and it has to be recorded that he possibly borrowed the nomenclature Iron Curtain from Goebbels, I quote, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent," end of quote. Even though the city ceased to be rigidly sandwiched between the Western and Eastern blocs after 1948, because of the Comintern split, the Trieste issue remained unresolved, and for many years to come, the collective imagination perceived the city as a quintessential Cold War stage, as well as theatre of a protracted mini-Cold War between Italy and Yugoslavia. At this juncture, global or local is very much global, very much coincides with global. At this time, in fact, the Cold War is arguably beginning to shift from a European to a global stroke regional perspective, increasingly outside the European continent and in other parts of the world, leading to the Korean War, of course, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, etc., etc. So my aim today is to explore Trieste's Cold War identity as it was both acquired and disseminated through the medium of film. And this is very much of a dynamic identity, periodically revisited, pending rapidly shifting geopolitical reconfigurations. In the words of the Finnish Cities and Transnational Interaction Research Group, I quote, "Cities played a more central role in the Cold War cultural interaction than hitherto acknowledged," end of quote. Precisely, I would add, in their capacity as intermediate and therefore more supple and dynamic agents of cultural signification and change, from both sides of the Iron Curtain. Situated at the very interface of communism and the Western democracies, Trieste makes a cogent case. So I shall be examining now Anglo-American, Italian and Slovenian material side by side. And this is a comparative angle that is regrettably still eluding film critics and historians alike. And it's what the Centre and the Finnish group are hoping to effect in future, to sort of push for a comparative perspective of this material. But why examine film rather than, say, literature, music, or other forms of popular culture? And it is worth emphasizing now that there was an extremely close relationship between Trieste and cinema right from the word go. In the late 19th century, the affluent commercial port lent the budding cinematographic art numerous entrepreneurs equipped with capital and vision. And to mention only a handful of names, I would like to recall the names of Antonio Permet, of Angelo Curiel, Max Carreiter, Enrico Pegan, Salvatore Spina. All of these entrepreneurs put capital and interest in developing film and cinema. And in particular, Salvatore Spina, between 1906 and 1908, made numerous films in Trieste featuring key sites of the city. It's also important to record that the first film screening in Trieste dates to 8 July 1896, which is only 6 months after the very first film premiere in Paris. A Salone Cinematografico Excelsior, a cinema, is Trieste's first dedicated screen, opened in 1906, at such a time when no other city in Italy, not even Milan, the hyper-modern Milan, had a screen at all. So, as a centre of film industry, Trieste and its hinterland feature frequently in Western productions of the post-war period. And this visibility is heightened during the Cold War years, particularly, obviously, the early Cold War, when Trieste's contented and liminal position came under the sharpest international scrutiny from both sides of the Iron Curtain. It's also, finally, interesting to note that a great number of these films borrow heavily from literature, importing into film literary idioms, plots, and tropes. And I'm thinking in particular here of Italo Svevo, if you know his novels, and as you will see in images that are, and clips that I will show later, there are some of these literary idioms that are imported into film, and also, of course, James Joyce, whose Ulysses sort of plays with Triestine characters and Triestine sites as well. Incidentally, I found somewhere a curious detail of James Joyce, who had attempted to become a manager of cinemas in Dublin, cinemas that were funded with Triestine capital. So at some point in his life, Joyce had engaged with film and with cinema, managing cinemas in Dublin that were funded with Triestine capital. These literary tropes imported into film include the quest for self, the mystery embodied by elegant ladies pursued in a coil of dark and dingy back alleys, and of course Trieste's status in the collective imagination as both a frontier and a military front. And it is particularly this latter dimension, the military front, that is taken up and exploited by Slovenian film. An ethnic minority in Trieste who suffered persecution during the fascist period, the Slovenes seemingly approached the problem of Trieste almost entirely from the perspective of a national and ethnic conflict and an unavoidably militant and military resolution. However, it is also worth pointing out that Trieste is not overly represented in Slovenian film. The archive of Slovenian film mentions only about 10 films featuring the city, most of which are documentaries. Some of these films were made during the Cold War, but the majority date to 2000 and more recently. However, there's one major motion picture entitled Thirst or Trieste, which I'm going to look at in a moment. But firstly, I'm going to look at this particular film. So I'm going to start looking at 3 Slovene films in chronological order. Na svoj zemlji, meaning on our own land, of 1948. Then moving on to Trst or Trieste of 1951. Both Na svoj zemlji and Trst were directed by Francis Stieglitz. Followed by a third film entitled Rudelci or The Felons of 1987, directed by Francis Slack. And I'd like to acknowledge the assistant of a colleague of mine, Matteo Colombi, at the University of Leipzig, who assisted me in obtaining this material. It's quite rare and it's not a very good quality material either, as you will see. Na svoj zemlji was the very first Yugoslav motion picture and is still fairly popular, especially in Slovenia. Released in 1948, it celebrates the partisan fight against the Nazis and the fascists. The ending of the film features a view of Trieste in the far distance and a dialogue between an aging partisan and a child partisan nicknamed Little Eagle. I'm going to show you a very short clip, it's 2.5 minutes long, of this film from Na svoj zemlji, and you have the English translation on the first bit on the handout.
Čáku.
To by byla to veselo. Ani do čáko.
Ty. Minú majú na vždy.
Najmä večka prijal, da bol na svoj zemlji svoj gospod.
Možno liči.
Okay, so this is the first clip. Let's bring back. Trieste is, as you saw, is seen at a distance and coveted as a dreamland, within grasp but unattainable as yet. The old partisan looking on the city reassures the little boy, little eagle, that Trieste will be one day his own, that it will belong to Yugoslavia. But it is interesting to note that this film was shot only 3 years after the Yugoslav troops had been rushed out of Trieste by the Anglo-American allies, who took up governance in 1945. The film therefore rests on an unresolved ambiguity. Yugoslav partisans appear to be poised to seize and hold and maintain the city, and yet, outside the fictional framework, Trieste is not at all in their power. Trieste so necessarily remains a hazy and dreamy object of desire, its sea gleaming enticingly in the distance. So moving on to the major motion picture, Thirst. As an alluring object of desire, Trieste becomes more attainable and more tangible in Thirst. And these are some stills from the film, but I wanted to show you just a very, very short film clip, just a few seconds long, with sights of the city from this film. Similarly to Nazvoj Zemlji, Trst embraces a utopian perspective. However, the fight for the city is seen here from the inside. The film features Yugoslav partisans and Italian communist dockyard workers taking the city victoriously after a glorious fight against the Nazi fascists. In this respect, this movie also highlights and problematizes the complicated ethnic and political mix of the Trieste communist group, which was made up of both ethnic Slavs and Italians, supporting the evidence of a shared fight for a common cause, traditionally brushed aside by Yugoslav accounts. And obviously, in cultural memorial discourses and practices, whatever is left out or forgotten is as important as what is remembered. So the following film clip features a heated dialogue between Piero, an Italian worker and communist militant, and his son. While Father Piero has divided national and political loyalties, of course he's Italian but he's also a communist, his son aggressively supports hegemonic Yugoslav plans over Trieste. And I'm going to show you the second clip here. You can follow their dialogue in the English translation in the second part.
Fin da piccolo mi hai sempre insegnato di oppormi all'ingiustizia. E ora non opporsi, non andare con loro, ma aspettare, e sempre aspettare.
Perché vendere la propria testa se penseranno altri a liberarci?
Altri? Chi? Che vuoi dire? Chi parla così nasconde altre intenzioni.
Altre intenzioni? Quali altre intenzioni? Parla più chiaro.
Voi temete la nostra lotta, perché volete che Trieste ricada sotto l'Italia.
E se così forse che male sarebbe?
Nulla. si dirà dall'Isonzo le cose stessero come qui. Allora si potrebbero eliminare i confini. Ma non è così. Ed è per questo che noi ci siamo schierati dalla parte della nuova Jugoslavia, dove l'operaio ha tutto ciò che ti spetta. Vattene pure lassù. Vattene pure. Chi te lo chiede? Non mi muovo da qui. E qui ti vogliono battere. Essi verranno da noi come fratelli, perché siamo noi a volerli. Che parlare da bambino è tutto. Parlo da comunista. Ed io? Che pensi che sia io? Non lo so. Vattene. Vattene.
So Father Piero will eventually be persuaded to join in on the side of communist Yugoslavia. His position, however, remains nuanced and well aware of local constraints and regional complexities. Veering away from official discourses, Trieste portrays a Trieste where ethnic Italian and Slovenes live and fight side by side for a common cause. It is interesting to note that despite its long-standing success, this film was initially pretty much ignored by critics and general public alike, probably due to this misalignment with the Yugoslav master narrative. And the third film, I'm not going to show you any clips of the films, is directed by Francis Slack, and it's a 1987 film, so it's quite sort of further later in the day, and only 2 years, in fact, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, so it's a radically changed Cold War scenario now. But the film is still set in the late 1940s. The protagonist of this film is a Trieste-born secret agent, Peter Bordon. Although Bordon is officially working for the Yugoslav secret services, the authorities eventually expose him as an accomplice of Italian political refugees who, after the Cominform, sided with Stalin rather than Tito's Yugoslavia. So even though Bordon is a committed communist, he will be prosecuted for his collusion with the so-called Italian Stalinist traitors. And so this film very interestingly exposes the fractious composition of the Trieste branch of the Italian Communist Party, which was divided between Stalin's orthodoxy to the USSR and Tito's own brand of socialism. One other important feature of Udodelci lies in its capacity to show the ethnic and political volatility of this region, and how this volatility spanned well beyond the Second World War and into the early Cold War period. However, as is the case with Nazvoj Zemlji, Trieste itself plays a secondary role. Still, importantly, the film relays the longue durée of the city's multi-ethnic and multinational makeup, from Habsburgian to Anglo-American, with some emphasis given originally to the Serbian Orthodox community in Trieste. So to sum up, 3 points I'd like to make about Slovenian film. Firstly, is that Slovenian films, mostly before the fall and dismemberment of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, but also later, deal almost exclusively with the partisan struggle. Peter Stankovic argued that Slovenian film contributed majorly to the construction of a myth of the communist partisan, and further showed the ways in which this archetype fed into a founding myth of socialist Yugoslavia. And I'd also like to mention here the work of one of the associates of our Center for Cultural Memory Studies, Vjeran Pavlakovic, who's also worked on this idea of the communist partisan as an archetypal figure in building a founding myth of socialist Yugoslavia. Second point, when the Slavs lost their battle for Trieste, the city in turn lost its capacity to stimulate an interest, so it was almost pretty much dropped from Yugoslav film. So while Trieste became a favorite destination for shopping trips to the capitalist West throughout the 1960s and the 1970s, the officialdom of film had all but cut the city out of its master narrative. And third point, this drop in interest overrides features that would have been important in the Cold War, especially at a later stage, such as the technological and the nuclear race and related commitment to pacifism in the 1960s. In fact, nuclear power and secret weapons are all but glossed over in these films, not dissimilarly to what happens, in fact, in Western films as well, where Trieste's caches is exclusively a sort of one of post-war, early Cold War city. On the other hand, espionage does play a role, majorly, as it will, as we shall see, in Western films. So I now turn to the Western side and will consider a handful of films spanning the 1940s, 50s and 60s. And I'm going to begin, in fact, with a wartime film, a wartime Italian film of 1942, Alfa Tau, directed by Francesco De Robertis. And Francesco De Robertis was the director of the media department of the Italian Navy in the 1930s, and is now regarded as one of the precursors of neorealismo. It's a wartime propaganda film, and the film centers around the submarine, il sottomarino Enrico Totti, that you see featured on that image. And why include a wartime film here? Trieste was, of course, a key city throughout the 1920s and 30s, a city described as the most fascist city in Italy, rebranded as a new utopian industrial centre fantasized by both futurists and fascists alike. The city became shorthand for the generic modernist metropolis, a radically modern, technologically advanced, electric urban space. So in this film, Trieste provides a blank canvas background, paving the way, however, for a mood change that will prevail in the post-war. And as we shall see, this mood progressively will reimagine the city as a murky, harbour-oriented, seedy Levantine microcosm, a city teeming with spies, clandestines, exiles and refugees, a demi-monde on the edge of legality, a playground of spies steeped in unfettered passions, prey to unrestrained violence. And it's interesting to note that this particular film is contemporary with Casablanca, of course, although it has nothing to do with it, but they're both dating from 1942. So, Alfa Tau seems to me to pave the way for what I'm tempted to describe as an Orientalist gaze on the city, a gaze that will shortly be taken on and propagated in the context of the ideological and cultural bifurcations of the early Cold War era. And I'm reminded here of a recent talk on Algiers, Paris, and the 1937 film Pepe le Moko, given by the Dean of UNIP in Paris, Andrew Hussey, in December. And Hussey was similarly propounding this idea of an Orientalist gaze, perceiving Algiers as a Levantine Mediterranean port, a timeless vieux Paris, untouched by ruthless modernization. And it seems to me that a comparison with Trieste is fitting, also because, like Algiers, Trieste appears to me as a lieu de mémoire, which is far from monumental and consensual, as is in Pierre Norat's definition of lieu de mémoire, but rather is a city where memories are very much fractured, divided, ambiguous, and reconciled. I've clustered these three films together, not because they have so much in common with one another, but because they're almost contemporary. Sleeping Car to Trieste is a 1948 film, La Città Dolente, 1949 film, Cuori senza frontiere, or The White Line, 1950 film. And beginning with Sleeping Car to Trieste is an English feature film I don't know, maybe some of you may know this film, directed by John Paddy Carstairs and released in 1948. And of course, as we already mentioned, 1948 is a crucial year indeed in world politics. Not merely because of the already mentioned ostracism of General Tito from Cominform. There are other events that play on the Cold War stage. We have a Czech coup d'etat, the Berlin blockade, the Marshall Plan in full swing, but also in Italy in particular, 1948 coincided with the most important general election in Italian history. Elections that became predicated upon a dilemma between democracy and communism. And of course, democracy meaning very much the Christian Democratic Party that was a close ally to the US. Deeply indebted to the US allies, Italy occupied a strategic geopolitical position in post-war Europe. Hinging loosely at Italy's northeastern margins, Trieste is at this time under direct US administration. Its national future seems indefinitely unresolved. So the Christian Democrats need only agitate the spectre of a prospective allocation of Trieste and its hinterland to the Eastern Bloc, which would have happened if the Socialist and Communist coalition that presented themselves to these elections would have won. So they only needed to agitate the spectre of Trieste moving on to the Communist side to persuade a majority of undecided Italians to vote the Western powers in. In short, Trieste is anchored to the West for fear of a palpable, if indiscriminate, communist threat. You know, never mind the Cominform split, communism is still, a sort of, it is still a sort of a generic, undiscriminate spectre to be rejected. Increasingly associated with the crudest instances of Cold War realpolitik, the name Trieste acquires suggestive, evocative overtones and becomes virtually ubiquitous. In fact, Trieste's name is at times grafted onto titles of films that have all but a tenuous connection with the city at all. And one of these films is precisely Sleeping Car to Trieste. There were two versions of this film circulating. One was entitled Sleeping Car to Trieste, the other one, Sleeping Car to Venice. So Trieste is just there because of the resonance of the name. If anything, this humdrum thriller paradoxically registers a flagging interest for the Trieste predicament. The city's international cachet slowly shifts towards its exotic curiosities, quite divorced from its unresolved and persisting national issues. And this is highlighted by a brief exchange between two American soldiers, one of whom is traveling to Trieste for the first time to join his regiment, while the second one is better informed and clued up. And I'm going to quote very briefly from this dialogue, and you will have to forgive my absolutely atrocious attempt at imitating an American accent. So soldier one, well, pal, I sure wish it was me. Trieste or gay Paris? I'll take Trieste, there's more variety. Soldier 2, yeah? Soldier 1, yeah, sure. Serb, Croat, Bulgarian, Austrian, Italian, Turk, and Greek. Obviously, the two soldiers are referring to the ethnic variety of local goers, not at all interested in any ideological or political predicament of the city at this time. With Cuori Senza Frontiere, we have an entirely different scenario here. Originally, the film, and in fact in the English translation and American translation, is entitled The White Line, which was its original title. And it's a well-packaged product, but also a sentimental muddle skirting around Trieste's unresolved predicament. The protagonist of this film is the white line of its title, a borderline arbitrarily etched by distant policymakers with no regard for its emotional impact on the daily lives of Slav and Italian local individuals and communities. Despite casting the alluring Gina Lollobrigida in the leading female role, as you can see her from the poster, the film flopped at the box office. However, it is interesting to record the frequency of film shootings and the frequency of sort of troops and crews, film crews, that came and descended on this area at this time. In fact, Tullio Kesic, who became a famous film critic and was involved in the writing the script for this film, records that the vexed residents welcomed the film crew with a bombardment of stones and other projectiles when they arrived. So the local residents were so annoyed and vexed with the incoming of more and more film troops at this time. And finally, La Città Dolente, or the Mourning City, is actually not set in Trieste but in Pula, which was a city in the Zone B of the TLT. And it focuses on the dilemma faced by an Italian family torn apart by an enforced exile from the motherland, now under Yugoslav rule. This film takes a less simplistic position on Cold War politics. While the introductory shots and much of the script are largely ansatto and pedestrian, and I'm really sorry to record that a young Federico Fellini was part of the team of scriptwriters for this film, but they did an absolute dog's dinner of it. However, the director, Bonard, is a master of suspended time. And so he's a master in creating the impression of a city suspended in time and suspended outside time and outside history, a bit like Algiers in Pepe Le Monceau. So Bonard's direction is effective in portraying the ideological and national dilemma faced by many borderlanders at this time, conjuring up credible spectral characters interacting mechanically against the backdrop of a split and alienating reality. Characters that are not stereotyped as flatly Eastern or flatly Western, but are rather nuanced and well aware of the reason of others. So the characters in this film remind us a bit of Father Piero in Thirst. They have more complexity and more sort of awareness of what goes on locally. This complex set of features and dynamics come prominently to the fore in Western films in the 1950s. And Hollywood at this point seems to take on the Cold War mystique of Trieste, portraying the city typically as a seat of espionage, counter-espionage, secrecy and intrigue, and not too dissimilarly from Slak's Hudeberzi here. So I'd like to dwell a little while on this very sleek Hollywood production entitled Diplomatic Courier, or Corriere Diplomatico in Italian. Directed by Henry Hathaway from Peter Cheney's novel Sinister Errand. The film is set in 1950, that is halfway through Trieste's Anglo-American governance, and it focuses on Mike Kells, who is a diplomat, played by Tyrone Power, and you're going to see in a minute some footage, a few scenes from this film where you see Tyrone Power all over Trieste, but in fact the actor never left the comfort of the Hollywood studios, and a stunt was used for scenes taken and shot in Trieste where he is. So Mike Kells is a diplomatic agent who becomes embroiled in a secret operation aimed at recovering a document allegedly detailing Joseph Stalin's plans to invade the whole of Europe. I mean, clearly Stalin was sort of spreading himself very well in the east of Europe, but in this film, Stalin's plan is to invade the whole of Europe. Trieste plays a key role in this film right from the word go. The city's perceived exoticism and historical cosmopolitanism nurture myths of its multiple, divided and alienating identity. Indeed, Trieste becomes a microcosm of the state of the world between the 1940s and 50s. As you'll hear, I quote, Il mondo in una città, the whole world is in this city. So the city epitomizes the whole world. As you will hear in the opening shots that I'm about to show you, the urban concretion of a cast iron, irreconcilable divide between East and West. And I'm going to show you the opening shots from Diplomatic Courier. You have the translation. The dialogue is in Italian. The translation is in your handout.
Ma è la prima volta che vengo a Trieste. È una città interessante. Quello che durante la guerra erano Lisbona e Istanbul, adesso è Trieste. Spionaggio, controspionaggio, incubatori, titini, antititini, stalinisti, antistalinisti. E in più 10.000 soldati inglesi ed americani, una popolazione simpatica ed entusiasta e marinai di ogni paese. Il mondo in una città. E sono ambiti dal campo? Ah, questo lo devo dire, un tassino aspetta. Quanto ci vuole per andare alla stazione? Dipende dall'autista.
So before winding up, I'd like to mention two films, both of 1964, but set in the early 1940s. And one of them is the one you see here, the yellow Rolls-Royce. And here, in this film, the cachet acquired by Trieste in the early Cold War seeps fairly indiscriminately into representations of wartime Europe. So, Anthony Asquith, The Yellow Rolls-Royce, is a film in 3 episodes woven around the yellow Rolls-Royce of its title and the vagaries of this magnificent automobile from London to Genoa to the Amalfi Coast and ending up in Trieste, as reads the title credit, Trieste on the Yugoslav border, the year 1941. And I can call it up. Here, this is the opening shots of the third episode of this film. The property of Gerda Millet, an eccentric US millionairess on her way to convey her salutations to the Queen Mother of Yugoslavia, this Rolls-Royce car will become a fairly implausible means of transportation for the Slav resistance fighting the Nazi invasion, mainly thanks to the exotic charms of the resistance leader, Zoran Davic, played by Omar Sharif. It is interesting that while the wartime borderlands are viewed through the exoticizing and intrigue-laden lens of the early Cold War, other sensitive issues are entirely glossed over, not dissimilarly, obviously mutatis mutandis, to what is the case in Yugoslav films. So there are certain issues that are completely ignored, if not sort of misinterpreted or misrepresented. These issues include the heavy Italian involvement in the Axis powers' 1941 attack on Yugoslavia, and, more crucially, for a plot constructed around the romantic liaison between an American millionairess Gerda and a Slav intellectual Zoran, no mention whatsoever is made of the ideological alignment of Zoran's freedom fighters. And we hear earlier on in this episode that Gerda is ferociously anti-communist, and in fact she's donated large sums of cash to support the anti-communist cause, and yet she's having an affair with Zoran and helps, implausibly, with her yellow Rolls-Royce to transport Yugoslav partisans who are very likely communists at this point. The second 1964 film I wanted to briefly mention is The Cavern. The Cavern that was released in Italy under a different title, Sette contro la morte. It's a co-direction in this film, Paolo Bianchini with Edgar Ulmer, and it's a British-Italian production featuring a group of 6 soldiers and one sultry lady, again implausibly, accidentally trapped together in a cave in the Karst, the mountainous border region between Trieste and Slovenia, in the last year of the Second World War. This oddly assorted group are repelling a Nazi attack. Now, this film is interesting not merely because it's shot almost entirely in the stifling and claustrophobic atmosphere of the cave, but especially it's interesting in the national groupings represented here and the interaction between these groups. These include British, American, Canadian, Italian and German soldiers. So pretty much the whole Allied military government is represented in this cave. And so the dialogues between these soldiers seem to carry a covert echo of the ambivalent and fraught discussions leading to the national resolution of the Trieste question in 1954. So to sum up, it seems to me that this bird's-eye view and comparative view of Cold War Trieste on screen goes some way to showing the extent to which the city functioned as both arena as well as actor of transnational interactions. Political and ideological, yes, but also cultural and memorial. My aim was also to highlight how, via the medium of film, Trieste was very much in the public eye on both sides of the Iron Curtain as a stage of ideological rivalry, but also as a seat of inevitable entanglements, ambiguities, and hybridizations. So I'd like to conclude my exposition with a universally known film of the James Bond saga, an international spy story depending on a commercial popularization of Cold War politics. 007, From Russia with Love, reinforces the mystique of Trieste's strategic positioning during the early Cold War years. Almost stereotypically, it portrays a Trieste as a perpetually contended, cosmopolitan, seedy Casablanca sitting uncomfortably on the cusp of the Western Bloc, sandwiched between communism and the powers of the West. So I'm going to leave you with a film clip from one of the final scenes of 007 From Russia with Love. And you're going to see a breathtaking boat chase skirting the coast of Istria, south of Trieste. And you're going to see the intrepid James Bond fobbing off the evil Spectre, all the while assisting Tatiana Romanova, who's an alluring Russian diplomat, here played by an Italian actress, incidentally, helping Tatiana defect to the West. Their final destination is a safe and secure haven, the city of Venice. And I'm going to leave you with this image.
You swim? Yeah, take the wheel. This way, please. Look, man step. Just isn't your day, is it? Venice. You look at all of you.
Shots, pistol, some flags.
Now give me those shots. Yes, we're here. It is true. Well, we've got plenty of fuel. A bit of luck, we should be there by tomorrow morning.
Which way are we going?
The shortest route, which is between those two mountains and straight along the coast.
very much.
What a way to end the seminar, right? Katia, thank you very much. I think Tyrone did himself a real injustice by staying in Hollywood and letting someone else walk around the streets of Trieste. Absolutely fascinating talk about the way in which geopolitics was played out in the media, with the particular gazes from the east and the west, and the different attitudes, the glamorized Western view, and the partisan movement being embedded absolutely through the films from Yugoslavia. There will be lots of questions, I'm sure, Katia, so may I invite anyone who has any comments or questions they would like to make, please.
I wondered what the current status of Trieste is. Obviously, with the disintegration of Yugoslavia and Slovenia coming into being, obviously it's much more stable situation, and now it's lying within a fairly stable Italy. So, given that, one would have thought that it would sort of regain itself in the sense that it's ideal kind of location for international kind of city-state or something like that, with harbours and presumably with airport and all that. But as far as I know, except for the one international institution, that the Institute for Theoretical Physics, which is located there does not seem to be any kind of renaissance either in terms of film itself or in terms of other international bodies or international activities. So I was just wondering, given this fascinating location, why it's still, in the present context, is still dormant, so to speak. Yeah. I don't know what views you have on that, what the current status is, because I don't know very much about Trieste. I have only been to Venice, never went beyond.
Yes, no, well, thank you. That's very relevant, in fact, because Trieste always was, a city of ambivalent, if not multiple, identity, culture, politics, etc. And this status somewhat is being carried forward, and it's still extant today. Obviously, with in a radically different context. We're no longer in a Cold War context, obviously. And also we're in a sort of European community where some former member states of the Yugoslavian Federation have entered into. So the economic partners are not on sort of on an opposite ideological standing on the other side of the Iron Curtain, as it were, or on opposite ideological sides. But yet, Trieste is still sort of struggling to overcome this peripherality, this sort of marginality, this idea of being really stuck at the very northern, easternmost margins of Italy. And there have been some very important initiatives in recent years. The one you mentioned, of the Institute for Theoretical Physics, which is a very important institution locally, and it brings in scientists from all around the world. There's also the United College of the Adriatic, which is another sort of internationalizing institution that brings in students and teachers from all around the world. From the economic and financial viewpoint, there's been obviously attempts to increase the volume of exchanges with particularly Slovenia and the former Yugoslavian neighboring countries. There's something called the Adria, which was initially, I think, a cultural association that was presumed to increase and extend links between the East and the West, but it's now become very much of an economical and financial reality as well. And but in terms of the film industry, that's something that's completely gone, so far as I know. I mean, I don't think the sort of early 20th century investment in film in Trieste that that was so prominent left any trace or any substantial presence of the film industry at all now, and so I'm not sure, but I don't think that's the case.
Thanks. Other questions or comments, please?
Thank you very much for your talk. I'd like to ask, two questions really. One about the language and one about how the film serves a historical vehicle. I mean, first about the language, I don't think obviously you've translated for us and so on, but I don't think you mentioned language as an issue as to whether Italian versions were really saying the same thing as English versions and so on. So I'd be interested in that. And in particular, I'm not sure that it was in the Torrent Power film, but certainly in other films like that, typically Hollywood films of the Cold War Europe, if they talked about Stalin's plans to invade, they wouldn't have said Western Europe, they'd have said Europe. In other words, they would have regarded everything beyond the Iron Curtain as not in Europe at all. It became culturally not Europe. And so I'd be interested about about the language. I've got another question. Do you want to deal with that one first? Or
Yes. Well, I'm not sure that I can say much more than agreeing with you that language is, of course, an extremely crucial issue here. And the ethnic identity is predicated very much on the linguistic differences that were in Trieste. And it's often said that the Slovenian and Croatian minorities in Trieste were very well versed in the Italian language, and they could take part in the city's culture if they wanted to. Whereas the Italian counterpart never made any efforts or never made any concessions to learning any of the Slavic languages. So and thereby sort of giving out a signal of lack of interest, or not sort of wanting to pursue the sort of communication with their counterparts. So yes, absolutely. I have to declare now that I don't speak Slovenian. I understand it very. I have a very rudimentary understanding of the language. So this translation comes from my colleague at Leipzig that I mentioned earlier, who provided me with the film clips as well. I'm not quite sure, what else to say. I'm going to agree with you that it's an extremely important, crucial aspect, and it's sort of contributed to the misunderstandings and the lack of communication across history.
You have a supplementary question.
Well, okay. The other question was really about historiography. I have been to Trieste shortly, and in my little sort of tourist tour, I don't remember any of this 20th century being on display. I mean, some of it I know because I'm old enough to know, but I don't remember it. And that rather compares a quite recent cinema conference in Vienna, where I did a week of being tourism, and again the 20th century was entirely absent from these enormous numbers of museums. The only one where the 20th century appeared was in the Third Man Museum, which is not one the city advertises at all. And it sounds really tacky, but it was actually terrifically interesting, but both as a film buff, but also because it dealt with the 20th century, and this whole, the question of occupation as well, which underlies a lot of this. And of course, occupation means a different thing to how you work. So, yes, the question really is to what extent people in Trieste or visitors to Trieste, are aware of this history and how much the film history of the 20th century, or is it a hidden thing or is it present?
Well, I think people in Trieste are very much aware of the 20th century and presumably there's to some extent a decision to forget or to brush aside many of the sort of atrocities and historical events that in the 20th century that are tainted with, sort of Italy's persecution, say, of the ethnic minorities and totalitarian regimes, etc. So, in a sense, and also politically, this idea of harping back to the Middle Europa, to a sort of Felix Austria, to a time that was untainted with this sort of compromise with uncomfortable, with fascism or with uncomfortable political allegiances, and hark back at a time of great prosperity where Trieste was created and the port was enhanced and capital came in and immigrants built the city and with enormous sense of possibility and things
so
that could happen.
Is this related by oral culture or literature or film?
It really covers quite a lot of cultural and political and also in society. You saw this very well. It's pretty much contemporary with the rise and the establishment of the Northern League movements in Italy, of the sort of federal and autonomous movements that claim that north of Italy should be be detached from the south of Italy and have autonomy and rule independently. And this is very much something that was prominent in Trieste as well, with the so-called Lista del Melone. And Melone was a sort of a prominent architectural feature in Trieste. There's a sort of big stone melon on top of a column that was put there by the Austrian-Hungarian, at some stage during the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and it became the symbol of the autonomy, Trieste's desired autonomy, and harping back at the time that was not tainted with fascism and with the atrocities that happened later. So it's very much of an escapist. The idea that the 20th century is probably best to brush it aside and a nostalgic harping back to a happier time. Also more distant in history, so less dangerous, less compromised.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. I thought it was fascinating to compare the different viewpoints. And I was thinking while I was listening to this that really the next thing that I would be really interested in is to compare different Cold War cities. I mean, different points at which, as you said in your introduction, you were setting out the parameters of the research project, the importance of cities in Cold Wars, and especially, obviously I would think of this, but the Trieste and Berlin. The comparison would be so fruitful and so interesting.
Oh, absolutely.
I've been thinking of possibly, just to sort of contextualize it, if you think of Berlin films of that period, then what is very much at the center is this kind of the Americanization of it. Yeah, this is our foothold in Europe. This is the American way of life we've imported into Berlin, very much like Billy Wilder and that sort of thing. Whereas in Trieste, that doesn't seem to have taken hold to that much of an extent. Maybe it's because this orientalization, the hybridization, takes more.
Well, yes, yes, it's interesting. Clearly, it's a different time that we're talking about, isn't it? You're referring to sort of more 1960s, perhaps?
No,
the erection of the Berlin?
Yeah, a little bit earlier. Really, the 50s, early 60s, 50s already. Yeah, definitely.
Right, because the view of Trieste is very much of an exoticized view, a sort of Eastern, almost Ottoman. There's a sort of Levantine view of Trieste. there's not so much Americanization there, and yet this view is sort of funded and made possible. You know, the conduit is Anglo-American technology and video technology. So it's an interesting tension. So it's almost as if Trieste is considered to be I don't know. It sort of plays on this idea of marginality, and it sort of highlights it and puts it forward. With Berlin, there's less an idea of marginality, probably, less an idea of an eastern, because geographically Trieste is much more on the cusp of the Western world in the post-war.
It's more this idea of a beacon of Western civilization in the sea of communism.
That's right.
So
That's right. That surrounds it from all corners. The issue of the wall is very interesting as well, because there is, as I mentioned, there's an Italian city, Gorizia, that was divided by a wall. But again, it's a very different scenario from the Berlin situation. The wall in Gorizia was erected in 1947, so well within that setup, the Anglo-American governance, and the wall came down. Well, you can't really call it a wall because it was more like a fence. It was a bit of a sort of joke of a wall, but nonetheless a wall it was. And it came down in 2004.
Same as that.
Same as that, yes.
Who built it? I mean, which side built it? To be Cold Warish.
Well, it wasn't. Again, it wasn't like the Berlin case where it was erected by the USSR side to prevent defection to the West. I think the wall was built jointly as it couldn't be reconciled basically as to whether that whether Gorizia was to be Italian or Slovenian, and so the wall was dividing within the sort of urban fabric of the city. So it wasn't an outside border; it was very much splitting the city in two parts. Gorizia on the Italian side and Nova Gorica on the Slovenian side. And interestingly, the centre came under Italian, sort of in the Italian side of the city, but the station, very important for traffic and commerce, was in the Slovenian side. And so I think this wall came down as a result of possibly Slovenia, of Italy lifting the ban to Slovenia's entry into the EU. Which was quite late in the day, because the Italian, in the late 1990s, when Slovenia wanted to enter the EU, Italy posed a veto. And it all had to do with retribution of local communities who'd lost property and land at the time when there were many exiles and refugees from east to the west. And so Slovenia refused to pay up, as it were, and Italy refused to let Slovenia join the European community.
We're going to just pause at that point because we're up against the clock. In fact, it's been so fascinating, we've gone past the clock, but that doesn't mean that we have to end now, but we just need to perhaps move outside, where I hope that we're going to find some lunch will still be left, and there certainly should be some fruit and tea and coffee for us to have. But before we do that, can I, on all our behalves, thank Katia most warmly for your seminar, Katia. You started, I think, at the beginning by saying that you were in the sort of the gathering in stage of information. We hope that the rest of that process goes well for you, and in the not too distant future we add another book to your list, which will perhaps be around, or at least including some of the material that you've been discussing with us today. So thank you very much, but that need not be the end. Do let us stay outside informally and have a cup of tea and coffee and some fruit and sandwich, and continue to discuss this fascinating topic. But for now, Katia, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.